For the next 2 months or 8 weeks, Glenn and I are going to be teaching a class on communion. We have communion thoughts every week, and we all, I think, recognize that communion is kind of, in many ways, the central piece that our assembly is built around. But honestly, it's not something that, at least in my church experience, there's been much teaching on. It's something that we all do and we all know. It's kind of like Thanksgiving, right? You know a lot of things about Thanksgiving, but we don't really teach about Thanksgiving very often. It might bring up the question, so we're pretty good at Thanksgiving. Why do we need to be taught about it? Let me ask a question right off of the get-go. We are creatures of habit, and we don't like things to be changed very much. Things like, Thanksgiving. There's certain things that have to be on the menu, and there's certain times that it takes place, and there's certain people that are supposed to be there, and there's activities that happen afterwards or before. I don't know what would happen if the Detroit Lions stopped playing football. I think the Davises would just fold up and go home. What's the point? Yeah. So, there's certain things that this is how it is. So my question is, and don't take this to mean too much about what we're going to do for the next 2 months. But my question to you is, if you found out that you were doing something not exactly right according to your faith, would you want to know? Yes?
Absolutely.
Yes?
Why would I want to keep doing it wrong?
Well, that's an interesting question.
It's comfortable.
Is there anything in your life that after you found out you were doing it wrong, that you didn't just immediately fix it?
So John, when you say absolutely wrong, it reminds me, Bill's opinion only, when you read the scripture, there's not a lot of absolutes.
There's not. And so, is there an absolutely wrong? That's a fair question. Let me ask the same question a slightly different way. If you thought you were sick, do you want to go to the doctor and find out for real? Depends. See, now it's getting real. Why might you not want to go? Ignorance is bliss. It's not fun. Sometimes those things start journeys that you weren't really wanting to go on, right?
I have a friend who refuses to go to the doctor because he just does not want to know.
Just doesn't want to know.
He's fine with that.
Yeah.
But I'm not that way. That would drive me crazy.
Now let me ask the second question is, if you found out that you were doing something wrong, would you be willing to change?
I don't like long division. I could get the answer
Yeah.
in school without showing all my work, but it frustrated the heck out of me because I would get counted off for not showing it and doing it exactly the way the teacher wanted, and that was a struggle for me.
Sure. Well, that calculator is probably what was making her mad. So we are going to talk about communion. We're going to talk about what the early church did, at least what we can look back as best we can and figure out what the early church was doing. And we're going to look at how the early church got its information about communion. And I assure you that through this class, you're going to be challenged to think, well, how would communion change if we were to think about it in a lot of the ways that the Bible presents it? Because I'll go back to what Phil said. There's not an absolute about how to do communion. Okay? So my point isn't to show up today. Glenn's point and mine is not to show up today and beat you all and say, hey, we're doing it wrong and we need to change everything and we have no idea what that change is going to look like, so just feel bad.
Try doing the cup first.
Well, yeah, just things like that make us pretty grumpy.
One gospel
So, yeah. So the point being is that, hey, I know that we're talking about something that is sacred to us. First of all, it is sacred to start with. But it's sacred to us because we've kind of grown up doing it a certain way. And we don't really love change. So I'm just going to start off with the request that you open your mind to today and for the next few weeks to allowing yourself to kind of go through some thoughts of what is this thing that we do, okay? So let's start with where we are, and I'm going to ask that...
Can I say something?
You can. Does that fit
How's
on
I
your
supposed
ear?
to do this?
So I'll let you talk in a second. It goes on your ear
Is this
like
the
that.
one Daryl was wearing? I don't know.
No, it's a clean one.
No, so I just want to tag on that right before you get started too much, because, so like many of you, I grew up in the church, and like with anything you do in any kind of culture, you can kind of grow up with something and kind of take it for granted a little bit. But so if you remember, I remember as a child, as a kid, sitting in the pews, the communion trays come by, and I thought, that looks interesting, I would like to taste that or drink that little cup. Can I hold that cup, And you want to do that. And it always reminded me of, you think about the Israelites when they're coming into the promised land and they cross the Jordan. What does Joshua have them do? He has one guy from each tribe grab a stone out of the dry bed of the Jordan River, and then they make an altar. And the key thing he says, when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Then you tell them, here's what this means. We came over from Egypt and through the wilderness into the promised land, and now we're here today. And so in the New Testament, God doesn't give us a whole lot of sacrifices and things like that to get tripped up on. But he does give us baptism. He does give us the Lord's Supper. And so when our kids ask, what does this mean? Then that's our opportunity to say, well, we remember Jesus and all that. But the thing about that is, when you ask that, you are a child. And so your parents will answer you according to whatever level your understanding is. Mm-hmm. But as anything else, as we get older and we mature and we have, larger mental capacity, most of us, we can understand things better. So we should revisit things occasionally, and including why we do the Lord's Supper. So whatever explanation our parents offered us, if you grew up in the church, we need to make that a little bit deeper, make it better. And it's not to say, like John was saying, we're not coming in here to, I'm definitely not, because I'm kind of like, I'm like Daryl. I kind of grew up as a legalist, I didn't call it that, but that's kind of the way I was. I'm a rule follower, whatever the context is, whether it's church or work or whatever.
You have no idea.
But so I'm not about changing things just to be changing things and turn things upside down or whatever. But we do want to understand things the way they're meant to be understood. And so it's okay to revisit things, and it's okay to question things, and you may come to the same conclusion, and that's great. But at least you'll understand how you got there and why you understand it, and not because of something you were told when you were 5 years old and you never questioned it again. So then hopefully as we understand things better, it's manifested better in our adult life, the way we are, makes our relationship with God better, our relationship with each other better, communion with God and each other better, and it's manifested in our behavior towards each other. Okay.
So yeah, there's a good purpose for this. We all come from different places. I mean, I want to believe that my first memories of communion are probably like Glenn's, and they're probably like yours, but that would be a huge assumption, right? Some of you may sit in our services on a Sunday morning and go, man, this is just not the way it's supposed to be done, but I like you all, right? That's entirely possible. So we want to start with, and it's one of the things I think Oakdale does really well, is we want to start with a position of flexibility, that we're okay with somebody coming at communion differently than we do. Because what is communion, right? It's coming around a table. So there's that. We just want to start understanding that. So I'm going to ask just for a couple of you, I don't want to spend too much time on this today, but I want a couple of you to tell me, what are your earliest memories of communion? And that can be, well, this is what we did, or this is how it was structured, or here's how I felt about it. But tell me some of your earliest communion memories. Really? How did that work? Did it take a long time?
It was a small church.
Never sit on the front row.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Okay.
My mom's side of the family were 1 cup of grape juice.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was 1 cup of wine.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever we went to visit, we would have the wine or the grape juice.
Okay.
And so there was that, not friction, but understanding that those are different. Yeah,
Mhm.
like you said, they're small congregations, so you
Right.
can get through it quickly.
Okay. Someone else?
Well, I grew up as a Baptist, in the Baptist church,
Mhm.
so they just kind of do it, a special occasion type thing.
Okay.
So it's not every week.
Okay.
So it would kind of be similar, but just 3 or 4 times a year maybe or something.
Okay.
And we don't have to get into this right now, but, when Jesus does it, he says, whenever you take this, do this in remembrance of me. So when they were doing it at Passover, does that mean we do it once a year at Passover? Or, but then obviously we have other things in the New Testament. They got together every week and they did their agape meal or whatever. So anyway, that's another take that someone could take on it. Like, well, we don't have to, whatever. But I'm not proposing that. I'm just saying
There's lots of
that's a reason people
Yeah.
might think it a different way. Go ahead.
Jerry?
My boss was a member of the Disciples of Christ, and I went to his funeral. They served communion during the funeral,
Mm-hmm.
which was, I thought, really unusual, but I think it went over well.
Mm-hmm. Randy?
I can remember visiting the different congregations, they played games with you. Lord's Supper would be before
Right.
the sermon or after the sermon.
Right?
You never knew, you had to watch them close, keep your eye on them.
Well, what does it say in 1 Corinthians 11? Was it before or
And
after?
then I found out that the best way to do it, because that's what my dad did, and that's what I did when we were at different congregations, was to always do it before the lesson. Then no one could complain about someone having to sit up there when they could be back taking care of their children.
Right.
So it always became before the lesson.
I know churches that have moved communion to after the lesson because too many people are getting up and leaving after communion.
Yes, yes.
But what you said too is, we used to have the guys march in at the beginning of the congregation and sit down on front on this side, on that side, and they'd sit there the whole time. But we don't even do that now. So, yeah.
I just remember it being very official,
Yes.
that all of the men were dressed in suits.
Yes.
They sat on the stage.
You and where did you go?
I grew up in Cordell,
Okay.
and they gathered around the table,
Uh-huh.
with the inscription and all of the things, and, the sacraments were on the table, and, it was very official.
Okay. Crazy. I did not grow up in Cordell. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. But 2 of the elders at the church that I grew up in were from Cordell. Walter Burkett. Do you know the Burkett, Walter and Ida Burkett?
I know.
Anyway, so I come from you, okay? And I say that because I remember the men lining up in the back, and I'd sit, where we would sit on the pew, and there was a basement underneath the church building, so the floor had a little bounce to it. And I remember really quickly the men would all try to get in step as they would come down the center with it was like a military thing. And you could feel the floor move as the men came down with the trays, and they'd put the trays on, and then they'd all go sit in the rows. And I knew that there was something really special about the men that got to stand in the center, and that the guys who stood on the end were working their way up if they worked out.
My memories are very similar.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. I promise you that we are from the same root of that whole experience.
Let me just say too, so you notice all the details are details. I'm like, all right, why are we doing the Lord's Supper to begin with? Oh, is it for everybody just up front? Is it to march down together?
Right.
And that's what I was saying earlier. In the New Testament, we're not given a whole lot of things, and maybe that's a good thing because we tend to get tripped up on those things, and we forget to make the main thing, like Daryl says. Not to say there's anything wrong with doing it this way or that way, and maybe God doesn't care at all or whatever, but we just need to always kind of keep that in mind regardless of what we think.
I would like for some people to pop their Bibles open and get ready to read some scripture. So I just want to see a hand of, yes, I'll read it. And then we'll do that near the end if we can. Exodus 6, verse 7. Okay. Exodus 29:45. Okay. Leviticus 26, 11 and 12. Okay. Ezekiel 34:30. Okay, right here. Ezekiel 11:20. Okay. Let's just call that enough, because I've got like 20 of them, but we're going to call that enough. Tell me about not just yesterday, but today. What is the mood? What is the vibe if you're young? What is your mindset during the communion part of our service? Larry.
This is along those lines. If a town outside of Pennsylvania, King of Prussia, there's a church with an auditorium a little bigger than this, and all of the pews are facing the stage, not, where you have to turn to see it. But then when you sit down, you realize they're not facing the stage, they're facing the communion table. The whole congregation is focused on the communion table.
Okay. Interesting.
So when you come in and sit down, you know what the focus of this worship is.
Interesting. I love how architecture can have meaning and spaces have meaning. Tell me, let me just keep picking on you. Where's your mind? What's your mood in communion?
I'm going to jump forward a couple of lessons. You're going to get to this eventually. But what I ponder what Paul meant when he said that you must take it in a worthy manner.
Yes.
Exactly what did you mean by that?
Yes.
And to me, you have to be focused. So to some degree, it's necessary to have the absence of distraction.
I hope that at the end of this 8 weeks, I don't want us to all have the same answer, because I think there's more than one answer to the question of what does it mean to take it in a worthy manner. And there's not just one sentence that answers that question. Maybe Jesus could do it in a sentence. I don't think we're going to. But I hope when this class is over in 8 weeks that you have a strong sense of what it means for you and that it's rooted in Scripture. Because I think that's one of the passages that we read, but we're not really sure what to do with. Someone else, what is your mood, your mindset during communion?
Well, I would like it to be reverent and focused, but I don't know if anyone else has this problem. My mind wanders. I can be thinking about Jesus on the cross, and 2 seconds later, I'm on, what I'm going to do next Thursday. And so, for me, it's like a mental exercise to make myself focus.
Okay.
And it's not, shouldn't, because I want to, I know I should. It's not like, this is a pain, I wish I didn't have to do this. I want to do it, and like Larry said, I want to do it in a worthy manner, but it's so hard for me. It's so hard for me to stay focused sometimes. Sometimes not, but sometimes it's very difficult.
Jerry?
In part, I think it should be unity. Going back to the passage, we who are many become one. I've even seen churches, we partake at different times. We pass it. Some churches, that everybody partakes of it all at the same time.
Right.
And so, there's a certain element of unity in our community.
Okay. So what we're trying to do today is, they always say before you solve a problem, you got to let everybody in on what the problem is, right? So what we're kind of working through is Are we all in kind of the same experience? Do we share a lot of the same journey of what we do, how we approach communion? And then as we start looking at what communion is all about, I think this is going to help a little bit. John Mark Hicks, in his book Come to the Table, which I think is a decent exploration of the topic. Not going to agree with everything that he says, but he does a really good job of introducing some ideas. He does a really good job, I think, at the beginning of the book of saying that there are elements of communion that are about a table, right? Because the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, takes place around a table. We know that in 1 Corinthians that they're having trouble with their table, with the way the table is operating, correct? We hear a lot of language of Jesus talking about my table, which is hilarious because he's a carpenter, and yet he doesn't own a table. He's probably made a bunch of them, but he doesn't own one, to the best of my knowledge. But what symbol has always been in my mind, even though communion is set on a table, and by the way, what is the appropriate thing to be on the front of the table? Thank you. In my memory, the symbol that is most central to communion is the cross. So all of a sudden I have a problem. I think we have a problem. Is it a table or is it a cross? But until we can resolve these things, I don't just want the tension of that. I want us to talk through the tension of this. So let me ask you a question. What's different about a cross and a table? First of all, let's just clarify what a cross is. It's the place where Jesus was sacrificed. And what do we call a place where something is sacrificed? An altar. So to help kind of break our thinking a little bit to get us on track, I want to ask the question, what's the difference between a table and an altar? What are differences between the experiences that you have in life? What are the differences between what takes place at a table and what takes place at an altar?
An altar involves sacrifice, whereas I think the table involves fellowship.
Excellent. Okay, let's go home. No. Well, let's keep going. What else? What else?
Well, I think on that same line, an altar is where you come to draw close to deity.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And a table is where you come to draw close to people. Right? So it's serving one purpose. There's two purposes in one thing.
I love this. So he says that an altar is where you come close to deity. A table is where you come close to people. Okay? I like that. But typically, why are you coming to an altar to get close to deity? You know, in the Old Testament, you came to the tabernacle or you came to the temple to get close to deity. But why would you specifically go to an altar on your way to temple? You're broken. Right, there's something that's separating you from deity, and the altar has the opportunity to provide some sort of repair, correct? So what's the mindset when you go to an altar? You need help, you need to leave something, remorse, humility. What's the mindset at a table? You bring something. You're part of. There's hospitality. It's a blessing. Do you see how that can make, first of all, can we suddenly just take a second and go, wow, God's doing something really big with communion? These are paradoxical, right? I'm supposed to be joyful and happy and celebratory, and I'm supposed to be somber and maybe a little bit of recognition of shame. That sounds like my family table. No. Do you see how complex this is? Do you see how big it is?
We take
In fact, I think it goes back to the very beginning. Because in the beginning, God and Adam and Eve walked together in the garden around all the fruit, and there was fellowship, there was intimacy, there was joy, there was relationship, and then that gets broken, right? And so we start this long narrative of God putting things back together, and we start this long narrative of this combination of sacrifice and fellowship. And so, crazy idea, communion's not a new thing. Communion is not a New Testament idea. It certainly isn't born there. When the early church studied the scriptures, what does that mean? What did they study? Law and the prophets. So do you think Paul ever talked about the old system to understand communion? Yeah. And so, how many of you have thought about communion coming out of the original covenant relationship that God establishes back at the beginning? I mean, where do we normally go when we want to give a communion thought or when we're thoughtful about communion? Where do we typically go?
The account of the crucifixion.
The account of the crucifixion, or Corinthians, or, we're in the epistles. That's where because we see them doing the communion, right? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be there. I'm just saying that there is a massive, rich history in the Old Testament that starts with the idea of covenant. Glenn, do you want to talk about? You want me to, or you can talk about whatever you want.
No, well, I'll just say something that I've told you already. But so, like he said, whenever Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper or Jesus' sacrifice, he uses the things that they knew, which was, the Jewish Christians anyway had grown up with sacrifices, and I guess even some of the pagans had done sacrifices or whatever, but the idea of sacrifice. I've never offered a sacrifice myself. I remember growing up as a kid, and my granddad, remember watching him, all of us cousins would gather around, and he'd go grab a rabbit out of the rabbit hutch, beat it on the head, string it upside down, skin a rabbit, and we'd watch him butcher that rabbit, and basically, we would eat it. Now, he didn't burn it on an altar, but if you think about the way the Israelites grew up, going to the temple or whatever, they saw that all the time. I mean, I think people have said it before, but if you went to the temple, or imagine the smell or the sight you would see, all the blood that you would see, and the kids would grow up seeing that. And even the Passover, we talk about Passover, the kids had to, or the family, we had to keep that lamb for a few days before they sacrificed it, so they had bond with it. And then when they slaughtered it, it really was a sacrifice, because, you bring a little animal into the kids, what do they want to do? Let's name it, no, let's don't. But so Paul was picking something that they could relate to. When we, as John said, when we think about communion, we think about communion. Well, because we already had it. It was in the New Testament. But when Paul was talking to them about communion and sacrifice, he was actually talking about literal animal sacrifices or whatever. So they had something to relate it to. We're at a little bit of a disadvantage that way, because we don't, as far as I know, nobody in here has grown up doing something like that. So it, again, it's something physical we do with a spiritual meaning, but we don't even do it physically. So we get detached from a little bit, and now even today we've got it distilled down to a little thimble full of grape juice and a pinch off of a cracker, and so that's kind of why we're talking about this now. So we kind of bring it back to the making the main thing. What is this? And as a result of that, how do I behave? How do we treat each other? How do we, what's our relationship with God and each other?
So originally, when a covenant was made in the Old Testament, when we go way, way back, the term was to cut a covenant. Does anybody know what that means, to cut a covenant? Rachel? So what was the, yeah, so why did they walk through all that? I mean, what was that signifying?
Symbolism of like, if I don't hold up my end of the bargain,
Mm-hmm.
may the Lord do to me as we have done to the same.
Right. So they would take an animal, they'd cut it down the middle, they would sprinkle the blood down the center of it, and then the parties of the covenant. So this is Jacob and Laban do this. Abraham does this with God. God's the one that walks through and how does he do that? He does that with a smoking fire pot and a blazing torch, which sounds an awful lot like what we see in Exodus with a flame by night and a cloud by day. God walks through that space and says, this is the covenant. And then they walk away and they're buddies. No, then they have a meal and they eat the thing that they split in two. Why? What's the point of the meal? What is the point of a meal, and why is it still part of the covenant process?
Meals are sharing. They're sharing where you drop a lot of pretenses, wipe your mouth,
Mm-hmm.
into the napkin, especially with barbecue.
Mm-hmm. Sure. A lot of ribs involved. You are who you eat with. Pretty tough, as Daryl said this morning, to eat with an enemy. I need to pray with my enemies. I need to show hospitality. Daryl's describing communion in that space. Is communion only what we do Sunday morning in the assembly, or does communion somehow make its way out of the assembly into other spaces? When it says in the New Testament that they met together daily breaking bread, is that a communion thought, or is that just a, hey, they met at Chick-fil-A, but not on Sunday because they were closed?
Jesus is criticized most for who he shares the table with.
Sure. So the meal is absolutely every bit as much important as the cutting of the covenant, of the walking through. So you have both the somber and the serious. I'm committing my life to this change. We were enemies before. We were not on the same page before. We were separated before. But now we have agreed that through this covenant, we are going to be one again. And then we live out that covenant by sitting around a table, dropping our weapons, dropping our pretenses, and celebrating, literally celebrating peace. Right? Welcome to peace. We had conflict before, we have peace now, and we celebrate that peace around a table. So here's my question. Is it possible that we have done a really good job of seeing the altar part of our communion service and not really explored or have made ourselves open to the table part of what communion is trying to help us accomplish? So what is communion? Is communion a place that we remember the death of Christ every time and we stop there? Or is communion also supposed to be, as Daryl was talking about, he did such a good job this morning on this, is communion also the thing where we commit to being people who sit around a table and become one and become family and celebrate what was actually done at the covenant? Does that make sense?
I think something that Jay said, we've lost some of the context, because if you were under the old law and you wronged somebody and you had to make a sacrifice for that, you brought them with you when you made the sacrifice, and then you approved the meal and you ate with them. Right? There was some reconciliation that happened between the two parties, and reconciliation between you and God happening with the same sacrifice.
Right.
And I think we've lost the second part where, like, the togetherness part of it. Like, we think a lot about the sacrifice, but not as much about the togetherness.
Okay.
My experience is probably similar to you guys growing up young. We
Mm-hmm.
And Paul's straightening that out. I believe that's where that,
Right.
what that goes back to. So, we have kind of, historically, if you go back far enough, separated the meal from the Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
We've come full circle now, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So, therein lies part of our problem.
Later in the class, we're going to actually go back and look at some of the struggles that the early church had with communion, because they were interesting. You're going to hear some things where you go, well, how'd they get there? Well, they got it sorted out, but it took a little while. I was telling Glenn, I said, as we were walking over to get coffee, and I say to get coffee because I'm currently off donuts. We'll see how long that covenant lasts. But we were mentioning that in a lot of ways, our donut time as a church is our table time. Now, that's really, to say that out loud is strange because we've already had our closing prayer. How can we do, what does that mean? But I think a lot of what we do as a church when we get together for barbecue, when we go have a donut and a coffee, when the men come together on Tuesday morning, or when the women get together, whenever they do, when we do small group, we are doing the table part of communion. Does that make sense?
We often use the terms interchangeably,
Mm-hmm.
communion and Lord's Supper.
Mm-hmm.
The institution of the Lord's Supper is separate from the wider realm of communion together. And so we're picking all that apart, and that's excellent.
Yeah, I have found a little tool. I don't know if I stole it from somebody or not, and I don't even know that it's perfect. I know it's not. But I like to do things like this. So there's Communion Big C, which is what we do in the middle of church, Communion Big C. And then I think there's Communion Little C, which is what we do when we're doing small group, when we're having meals with people, when we're having our donuts and coffee. Does that make sense? I'm not willing to say that there is not an element of communion to that. And in fact, I want to celebrate that the kingdom, quite honestly, is a picture of communion. Communion is a picture of kingdom. But we need to keep some flexibility, and that's what this class is going to be about, is kind of cracking, just putting some little cracks in some of the things that we do so that maybe we can get a bigger picture of what we're thinking.
I was just gonna say, you mentioned, why they ate the sacrifice for the meat.
Mm-hmm.
You're consummating.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a wedding, you stand up at the front of the church, you make your vows to each other, but if that is not consummated
Mm-hmm.
as becoming one flesh, then it's not a real marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same way with when we commune together as a church. If we take the symbols, but we never talk to each other,
Mm-hmm.
we never hang out, we never serve together, or we accept Jesus through baptism, but he's saying, eat my flesh, drink my
Mhm.
blood. If we don't do those things, then we aren't really his. It's not ours. So I think we do miss the point that we don't we're not really consummating our spiritual family together.
If we don't do the other
We
part.
don't eat together. This happens at my house all the time. I make us, I think, a good dinner, and my kid comes in and gets cereal.
Mhm.
I get upset about that because I think, that's a good way to insult someone if you don't
Mhm.
eat the food they put before you.
Or they want to come in late and eat it cold. That one makes me nuts. Anyway, we won't get into that. Has anybody heard of heaven talked about as a feast? Any feast language that you think of with heaven? Is it a mistake that we have a table to talk about what we're really here to be about? So today, really, I want to, we're going to read just a few scriptures just to kind of re-cement this idea that it's not It's not a new idea that God has been wanting relationship with us, that God is wanting to celebrate that relationship with us, that part is joyful, okay? That is heaven-level joyfulness, that we get to celebrate and we get to sit at God's table and that we have a seat there with our brothers and sisters, having had our sins washed away by the altar. But what I wanted to accomplish this week is create some tension for you to think about this next week, which is, do we typically spend all of our time at the altar and not think about the table when we're having communion? Do we just keep going back to the altar? And there's a phrase that I have really struggled with. Do I want to say this or not? But if we only are thinking about the altar, is there some level at which all we're doing each week is just re-crucifying Christ each week? And we never really come and sit. You know how strange that is, to just keep coming to the altar and seeing the sacrifice over and over and not walking through the door and coming into the table and enjoying the meal? So, yes, communion time is important. Yes, there's an element to the sacrifice and the elements and all of those things, but it becomes a doorway that we walk through into His kingdom. And in His kingdom, there's a lot of things, and there's a lot of great things, but I don't think a lot of them are somber and shameful and guilt-ridden, and I don't want to make too much of that. You got anything?
Yeah, you just made me think of something. So we think about the altar, and our altar was Jesus on the cross, and, do we re-crucify Him? But think about when Jesus was through with that altar, when He got off of that cross, after He rose from the dead, what are some of the first things He did, or when He first saw His disciples? He appears to them in the room, and He says, do you have something to eat?
Mm-hmm.
And He's going to commune with them. Or they're out on the boat, and He's built a fire on the shore, and they say, hey, it's the Lord. And they go in, and what is it? Bring the fish you brought, And so
Mm-hmm.
He's getting ready. After the altar, He's going to commune. He's going to have fellowship with His disciples before He leaves. And just, again, when John first said we're going to talk about communion, I thought, the whole 8 weeks on communion, I don't want to get too inside baseball, because as much of a rule follower as I am, and I like details, I don't like to leave it there. And sometimes we talk about church stuff, and we get inside baseball and talk about all the details, and even if we got totally right, so what? I mean, if you leave the doors here and you go outside and nothing's changed, then why? What was the point? So what you were just saying basically is, don't leave it at the altar. Let's take it out. And we read in the New Testament, the Christians, they met in each other's homes daily. Okay, well, we use Sunday, first day of the week, as our opportunity to get together, commune, but it doesn't have to end there. It should not end there. It should, even if we're communing and we're not eating something, it should all be about relationships. God said at the beginning, it's not good for man to be alone, and just not alone by ourselves without God, but also not alone without each other. We need each other's support to get to heaven, and so we need to be happy taking communion together. We need to be happy together in spite of differences, and we need to, when we're thinking about communion and other things, it ought to be reflected in our behavior and in our life when we go out into the world to be salt and light, not just for each other, but for other people we come in contact with that may not know Jesus.
Okay, so I've done a really dumb thing. I've handed out a lot of scriptures to read, and I didn't mark which ones I handed out. I have a list of about 20. So I'm just going to kind of go through, have you literally go across the room and cite the verse. I'm going to have you cite the verse and read it. And what I want you to be thinking as you hear all of these verses is think of yourself as a first century church person who doesn't yet have the New Testament, and think about how you would be hearing these verses, these Old Testament thoughts about God wanting table relationship with you. Okay? Dr. Reish.
6:7. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians.
Okay.
Exodus 29:45. Then I will dwell among the Israelites and be their God.
Okay. Jay. who signed up? They're right here, these two guys.
Ezekiel 34:30. Then they will know that I, the Lord their God, am with them, and that they, the Israelites, are my people, declares the sovereign Lord.
This is Leviticus 26:11-12. I will put my tabernacle in your midst, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you, and I will be your God, and you will be my people.
Okay. Is there anyone else? Yep.
Ezekiel 11:20. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God.
That's what's happening around this table is we are sitting at God's table. John 17, Jesus is talking of his prayer. His prayer is about unity. God, I want them to be one with us as you and I are one. He wants us to sit at his table and to be in close personal relationship with him. And he wants us all to do that together. And that's kingdom. That's this kingdom that Daryl's talking about. And he's calling us to that. He's not just calling us to the cross. He's calling us to his table. So think about this week what it looks like to live out being table people. Not just empty tomb people, but what does the empty tomb give you? What does it give? Where does it let you go with that ticket from the empty tomb? You want to close us in prayer?
Dear God in heaven, thanks for letting us be here today to talk about the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, communion. We pray that we have thought about it a little bit more deeply today, and we ask you to give us understanding and reflect on the things that we've shared with each other. Help us to be better followers of Jesus in light of that. We thank you for wanting fellowship with us, as we just noticed from all these verses that were just now read, the pattern there about you wanting to be with us and dwell with your people, and help us to understand that you are a good God and you want us to be happy and you want us to be good and you want us to be good with each other. Help us to think on those things this week. Thank you for it. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. Thank you.